The year was 1918. The sound of cannons had finally gone silent. For 4 long years, the world had been at war, a war that swallowed entire generations and painted the map of Europe with grief. When peace was declared, people thought the worst was finally behind them. They dreamed of rebuilding cities, families, and hope. No one imagined that a new and invisible enemy was already waiting, one that would reach every home, every country, and every soul. The Great War, what we now call World War I, had ended in November 1918. It was one of the deadliest conflicts in human history. Over 60 million soldiers had fought, and more than 16 million people had died. The world was exhausted, physically, emotionally, and economically. In Europe, fields once filled with wheat were now filled with graves. In France and Belgium, entire villages were nothing but broken bricks and twisted metal. In Germany and Russia, hunger stalked every street corner. Even countries far from the front lines, like the United States or India, had lost thousands of sons. When the guns stopped firing, people celebrated in the streets. In Paris, crowds danced beneath confetti made from old war bulletins. In London, church bells rang for hours. In New York, sailors hugged strangers. Everyone said, "The war to end all wars is over." But wars leave behind more than ruins. They leave behind wounds we cannot see, fatigue, malnutrition, and weakened bodies. And in that fragile moment, when the world was breathing again, a tiny microscopic organism began its silent march. No one can say exactly where it began. Some historians believe it may have started in Kansas, USA, inside a military camp called Camp Funston. Others think it may have originated in China, or among soldiers in France who lived in muddy, overcrowded trenches. Wherever it began, one thing is certain: it spread fast. In early 1918, a young cook at Camp Funston woke up with a fever and sore throat. By noon, dozens of soldiers were sick. By evening, hundreds. Doctors thought it was just seasonal influenza, something that would pass. But by the end of that week, soldiers were dying, and dying quickly. These were strong, healthy men, used to harsh war conditions, yet the flu struck them down within days. Their faces turned blue from lack of oxygen. Their lungs filled with fluid. Many gasped for air as if they were drowning on dry land. Doctors were helpless. They had no cure, no vaccine, not even a clear understanding of what caused influenza. In 1918, viruses were still invisible. The first electron microscope was decades away. One of the main reasons the flu spread so far and so fast was the war itself. Millions of soldiers were still traveling home by train and ship. They carried the virus with them across continents and oceans. A single coughing soldier on a crowded transport ship could infect hundreds before the voyage ended. When those ships docked, the flu leapt onto new shores. From Kansas to Boston, from France to Britain, from India to Africa, the disease traveled with incredible speed. In an era before commercial air travel, it was astonishing how connected the world already was, by ships, trains, and soldiers. Each returning army unit brought not just war stories, but invisible particles of danger. In March 1918, American newspapers mentioned an unusual flu in army camps. By April, it had reached Europe. By June, it was in Asia and Africa. The planet had never seen an illness move like this before. The name Spanish flu has always been misleading. The virus did not start in Spain, but during the war, many countries censored the news. Governments feared that reports of sickness would lower morale. So when soldiers fell ill in Britain, France, or Germany, newspapers said little or nothing. Spain, however, was neutral. It wasn't fighting in the war, so Spanish journalists were free to write about what they saw. In May 1918, Spanish newspapers reported that King Alfonso XIII himself had fallen ill with the strange new influenza. Because Spain was the first to talk about it openly, the world assumed the disease had started there, and the name stuck. In truth, the flu had already spread far beyond Spanish borders. To understand how terrifying this new sickness felt, we have to imagine life back then. There were no antibiotics, no ventilators, no modern vaccines. Even simple medicine like aspirin was expensive. Hospitals were small, often crowded, and lacked proper sanitation. Many people still lived in shared homes or dormitories, especially workers and soldiers. In cities like London, Paris, or Bombay, trams were packed with people shoulder to shoulder. Markets buzzed with voices. Public gatherings were common. Parades for peace, welcome home celebrations, weddings after years of waiting. Every hug, every handshake, every cheer became an invisible chain for the virus to follow. At first, doctors called it three-day fever, but this was not an ordinary fever. It came suddenly, a headache, sore throat, chills. Then within hours, the patient could barely breathe. Their skin turned gray-blue as oxygen ran low. Sometimes blood came from the nose or mouth. People said victims looked as if they were suffocating underwater. The Spanish flu was unlike anything the world had seen. In just a few months, it infected 1/3 of the world's population, more than 500 million people. It reached every corner of the earth, from Arctic villages in Alaska to small Pacific islands, from deserts in Africa to the crowded streets of India. There was no continent untouched. Ships carried the virus to Australia and New Zealand. Railways took it across Siberia. Caravans carried it into remote parts of Persia and Africa. Even animals seemed uneasy. Pets grew restless. Birds fell silent. The world itself felt feverish. And all of this happened while countries were still reeling from the war. Many doctors and nurses were overseas serving the military. Medical supplies were scarce. Hospitals, already full of wounded soldiers, now overflowed with flu patients. It was as if humanity had opened one door of suffering, only to find another waiting. At first, people did not understand what was happening. Rumors spread quickly. Some said the flu came from poisoned gas used in the war. Others said it was spread by German spies, or that it came from spoiled food. In some places, people even blamed the weather or evil spirits. Governments urged calm. They told citizens to rest, stay warm, and drink hot tea. But the advice did little good. The virus moved faster than any government could respond. In the United States, cities like Philadelphia and Boston were hit hard. In September 1918, Philadelphia held a huge parade to celebrate returning soldiers. Thousands lined the streets, cheering and singing. Within 3 days, every hospital in the city was full. By the end of that week, nearly 5,000 people had died. The lesson was brutal. Gatherings spread death. And yet people found it hard to stay apart. After years of war, they longed to be together again. As the months went by, life changed completely. Schools closed. Churches stopped holding services. Factories reduced workers to half shifts. Cinemas and theaters went dark. Even weddings and funerals were limited to a handful of people. Masks became a common sight. Made of cloth or gauze, tied with strings behind the ears, they covered every face, from street sweepers to policemen. Some cities passed laws requiring masks in public. In San Francisco, people who refused were fined or even arrested. The sight of masked crowds became the symbol of the time. But masks were far from perfect. They helped, but they couldn't stop everything. The virus was too small, too clever. It floated through the air with every breath or cough. One sneeze could infect a whole room. Unlike most flu outbreaks, this one was unusual. Ordinary flu usually harms the very young and the very old. But the Spanish flu targeted people between 20 and 40 years old, the strong, healthy adults that were the backbone of every society. Many of them were soldiers or workers, the same people the world needed to rebuild after the war. This made the loss even harder. Families lost parents instead of grandparents. Children were left without mothers or fathers. Entire households disappeared within weeks. Scientists later learned that this flu caused a violent reaction in healthy immune systems, a cytokine storm, where the body's own defense attacked its lungs. But in 1918, no one knew that. They only knew that strength offered no protection. Still, amidst all the fear, humanity did not surrender. Doctors, nurses, and volunteers worked tirelessly, even when they knew the risks. Medical students helped in hospitals. Women formed community aid groups to bring food and water to sick families. Factories switched from making uniforms and weapons to producing masks and stretchers. In cities, neighbors cared for orphaned children. In small towns, teachers turned classrooms into makeshift clinics. Priests and imams prayed over patients. People sang softly through closed windows to comfort one another. Even when the streets were silent, small acts of kindness whispered through the world. By the time summer 1918 arrived, the first wave of the Spanish flu seemed to fade. People began to hope it was over. Schools reopened, markets came back to life. Newspapers said the danger had passed, but they were wrong. The virus had not disappeared. It had only paused. Mutating quietly, it was preparing to return stronger, deadlier, and far more ruthless. The second wave, which began later that year, would change everything. The year was still 1918, and the world was trying to heal. Soldiers were coming home from war. Families were reuniting after years of waiting. In many places, people had finally begun to smile again. The newspapers spoke of peace, rebuilding, and new beginnings. But quietly, something else was happening. Something no one could see. Something that did not care about peace or borders. Imagine a tiny speck, so small that even the best microscopes of that time couldn't see it. That was the influenza virus. It had no face, no flag, no name. It could travel anywhere, in the air, on a handshake, on the fabric of a soldier's uniform. It needed no passport. And in 1918, when the world was connected by crowded ships and trains, it found the perfect road to travel. Every day, thousands of soldiers were boarding ships to go home. They were happy, tired, and ready to see their families. But among them, hidden inside their lungs and throats, was a traveler, the flu. And as these soldiers returned to towns and villages, the flu followed them. At first, it didn't look dangerous. Just a few coughs, a fever here and there. Doctors said, it's just the usual influenza. But this usual flu soon began to behave in very unusual ways. Let's go back to the United States, early 1918. In the middle of Kansas stood a large military base, Camp Funston. Thousands of young men trained there before being sent to Europe. One morning in March, a soldier named Albert Gitchell, a cook, reported feeling unwell. He had a sore throat, fever, and headache. By lunchtime, dozens more men were sick. By evening, the camp hospital was full. Doctors worked tirelessly, but the illness moved faster than they could treat it. By the end of the week, over 1,000 soldiers had fallen ill. Some died within days. The camp's officials tried to contain it, but soldiers from Camp Funston were already boarding trains heading east, to other camps, to ports, to ships bound for Europe. And with them went the virus. By April, cases appeared in Boston, New York, and Philadelphia. Within weeks, it had crossed the Atlantic Ocean. British, French, and German soldiers began falling sick too. The first wave had begun. World War I had created the perfect environment for a virus to spread. Soldiers lived close together in crowded barracks and trenches. They shared water, food, and air. Their immune systems were weak from hunger, cold, and exhaustion. And there was constant movement from one base to another, from one country to the next. Doctors in military hospitals began to notice something odd. This wasn't like any flu they had seen before. Patients had bleeding from the nose and ears, blue lips, and lungs filled with fluid. Many young, strong men, the kind who could march for miles and survive battle, now couldn't survive this fever. In the muddy trenches of France, soldiers began calling it the gas sickness, thinking it was leftover poison gas from the war. But it wasn't gas. It was something much smaller and far more dangerous. Today, we understand that influenza is caused by a virus, something that lives only to multiply inside our cells. But in 1918, scientists had no idea what a virus truly was. They could not see it, could not isolate it, and had no medicine to stop it. They thought influenza came from bacteria. They tried to use masks soaked in chemicals or sprays of disinfectant in the air. None of it worked. Even worse, there were no vaccines and no antibiotics. Antibiotics like penicillin would not be discovered until more than 10 years later. So when people caught pneumonia after the flu, a common complication, there was little doctors could do. Doctors relied on rest, fluids, and hope. But hospitals filled too quickly. There weren't enough beds, nurses, or supplies. Some schools were turned into emergency hospitals. Church halls became wards. Doctors wrote in their journals, "The patients are blue and gasping for air. Nothing seems to help them." By the middle of 1918, the first wave seemed to fade. People began to relax. Cities reopened, children returned to school. But in late August, reports of a new outbreak came. This time from Boston's Camp Devens, another American military base. Doctors who had treated the first wave immediately noticed something alarming. This version of the flu was different, faster, deadlier, crueler. Within hours, healthy young men turned pale, struggled to breathe, and died. Their lungs filled so quickly that even oxygen, which was rare then, couldn't save them. The disease had changed. The virus had mutated. It had become stronger. And now it was ready to sweep across the world again. The new, deadlier wave began moving like fire in the wind. American ships carried it to Europe. From Europe, it spread to Africa, Asia, and South America. British troops carried it to India and the Middle East. French soldiers brought it to North Africa. Before long, it had reached every continent on Earth. In India, it was called the Bombay fever. In South Africa, the Blue Death. In Spain, people called it La Gripe. No matter the name, the fear was the same. Imagine this. In one village, people woke up to see their neighbors coughing and weak. By evening, entire families were gone. Doctors couldn't visit everyone. Funeral services were so full that cemeteries ran out of space. And still, the trains kept running. The ships kept sailing, and with them, the virus continued its journey. In London, people wore masks on the streets. Posters said, "Coughs and sneezes spread diseases. Cover your mouth." Children were told not to go near friends who were ill. Hospitals were overwhelmed. In New York, bodies filled the morgues. The city ordered public gatherings to stop. Schools were closed, and church bells rang every hour for funerals. Still, the sickness spread from home to home. In India, the situation was worse. The monsoon season brought damp, crowded living conditions. More than 12 million people died there alone. On the banks of the Ganges River, funeral pyres burned day and night. It became one of the darkest moments in the country's history. In Africa, missionaries wrote letters describing entire villages falling silent. In Alaska, small indigenous communities disappeared entirely, wiped out by the virus before help could arrive. There was no place safe, no country untouched. Doctors began to notice patterns. The virus spread mostly through droplets, when someone coughed, sneezed, or even talked. These droplets floated in the air and landed on others. So people were told to wear masks, keep distance, and avoid crowds. Lessons that would sound very familiar a century later. But not everyone listened. In some cities, people thought the flu was exaggerated. They wanted to go to work, to school, to the theater. And when restrictions were ignored, cases exploded again. Cities that closed early, like St. Louis, saved thousands of lives. Cities that waited, like Philadelphia, suffered terribly. This became one of the first lessons in public health, that prevention saves lives. Meanwhile, the world was still fighting the final battles of World War I. On the Western Front, soldiers coughed inside their helmets. Doctors had to decide who to treat, the wounded or the sick. Sometimes the hospitals had both kinds of patients lying side by side. In some battles, more soldiers died from flu than from bullets. The flu helped the war spread, and the flu helped end the war faster because entire armies were too weak to fight. In Germany, the epidemic destroyed morale. In Britain and France, troops collapsed from fever. The flu became an invisible soldier on every side, attacking everyone equally. When the armistice was finally signed in November 1918, the soldiers who returned home carried more than medals. They carried the virus to their families. By winter, the world was at war again, not against nations, but against nature. In homes, mothers cared for sick children, only to fall ill themselves. In hospitals, nurses fainted from exhaustion. In towns, carts moved through the streets to collect bodies. There were not enough coffins or gravediggers. In one report from Philadelphia, officials said they ran out of wood for coffins. In India, funeral fires burned day and night. In small Alaskan towns, entire communities vanished. Everywhere the air was filled with silence, the silence of fear. Doctors did their best. They advised rest, fresh air, and clean surroundings. Some suggested gargling with salt water. Others gave whiskey, quinine, or aspirin. But nothing truly worked. In fact, some patients died from overdoses of aspirin. People took too much, hoping it would bring down the fever. No one knew what else to do. The medical world was in the dark. They didn't yet understand that this flu was caused by a virus that lived in the lungs and throat, spreading from one person to another faster than any other known disease. By the end of 1918, it seemed as if the world itself had fallen sick. The war had killed millions, but the flu killed even more. In many countries, newspapers stopped counting the dead because the numbers grew too high. Some historians later estimated that over 50 million people, perhaps even 100 million, died during the pandemic. Think about that for a moment. 50 million people, gone within 2 years. That's more than the number of soldiers and civilians killed in World War I. It was one of the darkest chapters in human history. And yet, through all of it, people kept hoping. They prayed. They helped their neighbors. They carried on even when they were afraid. Because that's what humans do. Even in the worst of times, they keep going. By the beginning of 1919, the flu began to slow down. The virus had burned through so many people that there were fewer left to infect. Some who survived gained immunity. In many towns, people slowly came back out of their homes. Life began again, but it was different. Families were smaller. Children were orphans. Cities were quieter. The world had changed forever. Governments and scientists promised to study what had happened, to make sure it would never happen again. But for years, the Spanish flu remained a mystery, a ghostly memory whispered by grandparents, rarely written in history books. It would take almost a century before scientists finally discovered exactly what caused it, the H1N1 influenza virus preserved in the frozen lungs of victims in Alaska. Only then did we fully understand the scale of what humanity had faced. The Spanish flu was more than a disease. It was a test of strength, compassion, and courage. It showed that even when the world breaks apart, people can find ways to hold it together. It taught nations that health matters as much as peace. And though it left scars, it also left lessons. Lessons that we still remember today. By the end of 1918, the Spanish flu had reached every continent on Earth. There was no corner of the world untouched. From the quiet villages of Alaska to the crowded streets of India, from the deserts of Africa to the islands of the Pacific, the illness spread like a shadow that refused to fade. The newspapers no longer called it an outbreak. It had become a pandemic, a word few people understood at the time, but they could see what it meant. It meant sickness everywhere. It meant fear in every home. Imagine waking up one morning in 1918. You hear coughing from the next room. Your neighbor's door is closed and has been for days. The street outside is quiet. No laughter, no footsteps, no shopkeepers calling out. Only the sound of the church bell ringing. Again. Another funeral. That was daily life for millions of people. The world was no longer fighting one war. It was fighting a silent enemy that no one could see. Doctors described entire hospitals filled with patients gasping for air. Nurses fainted from exhaustion. In cities, carts moved through the streets carrying the dead to burial grounds. In some places, bodies had to be buried in mass graves because there were too many to count. In big cities like New York, London, Paris, and Bombay, people began to disappear behind closed doors. Families hung black ribbons on their windows to show they were mourning. Church bells rang so often that people said they couldn't tell one funeral from another. The fear was everywhere, not loud, but heavy, like fog. The Spanish flu wasn't just a bad cold. It was one of the most aggressive illnesses in history. When someone caught it, the virus went straight to their lungs. Within hours, it caused high fever, body aches, and deep fatigue. Soon the lungs began to fill with fluid. People struggled to breathe. Every breath became a battle. Their faces turned pale, then blue. In many cases, they died within 2 or 3 days. Doctors were helpless. There were no antiviral drugs, no antibiotics to treat infections that followed, and no oxygen machines to help people breathe. All they could do was try to comfort the sick and hope their bodies were strong enough to fight back. Even more frightening was how fast it spread. A single sneeze could send millions of tiny droplets into the air, each carrying the virus. Anyone nearby, on a train, in a market, at church, could inhale it. By the time symptoms appeared, the person had already infected others. That's why no matter how many doors people locked or how many cities banned gatherings, the flu always seemed one step ahead. The first wave in early 1918 was bad but survivable. The second wave, which began in September 1918, was catastrophic. It killed faster and struck harder than before. And it spread during the final months of World War I, when millions of people were still on the move. Ships leaving American ports carried thousands of soldiers across the Atlantic and unknowingly carried the virus too. By the time they reached Europe, men were already coughing and feverish. In army camps across France and Britain, the flu spread like wildfire. In October alone, 195,000 Americans died. In just 4 weeks, entire communities vanished. In India, where conditions were overcrowded and food was scarce, an estimated 12 to 18 million people died. Bodies floated down rivers. Families had to bury their loved ones with their own hands because no help came. In Africa, the flu followed trade routes and rail lines. Villages lost most of their adults, leaving only children behind. In some Pacific islands, such as Western Samoa, up to 1/3 of the population perished in a matter of weeks. It was as if the earth itself had fallen ill. You might wonder, why didn't doctors find a cure? Why didn't hospitals stop it? The answer is simple but sad. They couldn't. In 1918, modern medicine was still very young. Viruses had not yet been seen under a microscope. Vaccines for flu did not exist. Antibiotics, which could treat pneumonia, wouldn't be discovered until 1928. So doctors did what they could. They used home remedies: warm milk, garlic, whiskey, or vinegar. Some hospitals gave patients oxygen through rubber tubes. Others used mustard plasters, herbal teas, or bed rest. But nothing truly worked. Doctors wore masks made of gauze, washed their hands in carbolic acid, and hoped for the best. Many of them got sick anyway. Some died alongside their patients. In those days, even the simplest hospital tools were in short supply. Beds ran out, blankets ran out. Sometimes nurses tore up their own clothing to make bandages. And still, more people came. When the flu struck, there were heroes everywhere, not soldiers or generals, but ordinary people. In cities, volunteers went door to door, bringing food and medicine to sick families. Women's groups organized soup kitchens to feed those who couldn't cook. Teachers turned their classrooms into hospital wards. College students became nurses overnight. In Philadelphia, hundreds of young women joined the Red Cross, delivering medicine and blankets on bicycles. In small towns, church members helped bury the dead, because there were no grave diggers left. In villages in India and Africa, elders cared for orphaned children. People risked their own lives every day because helping others was the only way to fight back. One nurse in Boston wrote in her diary, "I have never seen death so close. Every room I enter has someone dying. And yet, when a patient smiles through their pain, it feels like sunlight breaking through the fog." Governments around the world began issuing public health orders. People were told to wear masks, wash hands often, and avoid crowds. Streetcar conductors refused to let passengers board without face coverings. Cinemas and theaters were closed. Even church services were canceled, something almost unthinkable in those times. In San Francisco, city officials made masks mandatory. Signs read, "Wear a mask and save your life." But not everyone obeyed. Some people said masks were uncomfortable. Others claimed the flu was exaggerated. The city even had mask police who fined or arrested those who refused. In some places, people made jokes about masks, drawing funny faces on them or cutting holes to smoke cigars. But when infection numbers rose, the jokes disappeared. Fear replaced laughter once again. These were the first large-scale lessons about public health, lessons that would later help the world prepare for future pandemics. In October 1918, Philadelphia became one of the worst-hit cities in the world. The month before, officials had allowed a large parade to celebrate soldiers returning from war. Thousands attended. Within 3 days, every hospital bed in the city was filled. Within a week, the city morgue overflowed. The death toll climbed so fast that they ran out of coffins. Schools, churches, and businesses shut down. Newspapers stopped printing obituaries because there were too many to list. A city that had once been full of celebration became silent, except for the sound of ambulance bells and funeral wagons. The same stories repeated everywhere, from Chicago to Paris, from Rio de Janeiro to Delhi. Theaters turned into makeshift hospitals. Public parks became graveyards. Even government buildings were filled with the sick. It was not just a health crisis. It was a collapse of daily life. One of the strangest things about the Spanish flu was how it erased the idea of borders. For the first time in human history, people in every nation faced the same invisible enemy. The virus didn't care about language, religion, or politics. It infected everyone equally: soldiers, kings, farmers, and teachers alike. In Britain, the Prime Minister caught the flu. In Spain, even the king was bedridden. In Iran, tribal leaders and peasants alike died in the same villages. In America, native communities were almost wiped out. Everywhere, grief spoke the same language. People began writing letters to each other, sharing comfort across oceans. Newspapers in one country printed prayers from another. Even in the middle of despair, humanity found connection. Perhaps the saddest stories were those of children. In many towns, both parents died, leaving behind sons and daughters to fend for themselves. Churches and charities took in orphans. In some villages, older children became parents overnight, cooking, cleaning, and caring for their younger siblings. Teachers, who had once taught reading and writing, now spent their days feeding hungry children and comforting the sick. They said the hardest part wasn't the coughing or the fever. It was the loneliness. Children missed their friends, their schools, and their old lives. The laughter of childhood was replaced by the silence of loss. One little girl in Chicago wrote in her diary, "Everyone is gone. Mama says it's the bad air. I wear my mask and pray to God to make it stop." Her diary ended a week later. After months of suffering, something unexpected happened. By early 1919, the number of new cases began to drop. Doctors didn't know why. Some thought the virus had burned through all the people it could infect. Others believed people were now immune. In truth, it was both. The virus had run out of fuel. Too many had died or recovered. Slowly, the pandemic began to fade. Cities reopened. Children returned to school. Shops and theaters opened their doors again. But the joy was quiet. There were too many missing faces. Every family had lost someone. Every heart carried a scar. When it was finally over, more than 50 million people were dead. Some say even 100 million. That was 1 out of every 30 people on Earth. The world had fought a war and a plague in the same breath. Economies were broken. Governments were shaken. But life slowly returned. People planted gardens again. Children played in the streets. Music returned to the cafes. Yet no one forgot what had happened. The Spanish flu had taught humanity that health was not just a personal matter, it was a global one. It had shown that the world was connected in ways people had never realized before. And it proved that even in darkness, compassion can survive. When people looked back at 1918 to 20, they realized that the flu had changed the course of history. It had ended the war faster by weakening armies. It had inspired new ideas in medicine and public health. It had shown that governments must be honest and quick to act. And perhaps most importantly, it had reminded everyone how fragile life can be. From that point forward, scientists began working to understand viruses, to prevent such a tragedy from ever happening again. Years later, their research led to vaccines, antibiotics, and modern medical care. The sacrifices of 1918 were not forgotten. They became the foundation of the health systems we rely on today. The Spanish flu was a storm unlike any other, silent, invisible, and merciless. But the world survived it, not because of science alone, but because of courage, kindness, and unity. And as history moved forward, humanity carried its lessons about humility, strength, and hope. When people talk about wars, they remember soldiers. When people talk about pandemics, they remember numbers. But behind every number, there was a face, a nurse, a doctor, a mother, a child, a stranger who refused to give up. The story of the Spanish flu is not only a story of loss, it is also a story of courage, a story of how ordinary people became heroes, not with weapons, but with kindness and care. When the flu struck, there were not enough doctors in the world. Many had died in the war or were still serving on the front lines. Hospitals were overflowing. Schools and churches had to become emergency wards. The newspapers printed a desperate plea. Volunteers needed. Nurses, helpers, anyone willing to serve the sick. And people answered. Some were trained nurses. Most were not. They were teachers, students, housewives, farmers, people who had never seen the inside of a hospital before, but they stepped forward anyway. In Philadelphia, over 1,000 women joined the Red Cross in a single week. They learned how to mix disinfectant, how to make masks, how to comfort the dying. They worked long hours, often without rest, food, or proper protection. Many got sick themselves. Many never came home. Yet, they kept going because the world needed them. In almost every city, nurses were the beating heart of the fight. They were called angels in white, though their aprons rarely stayed white for long. They moved from bed to bed, checking pulses, wiping fevered brows, lifting water to cracked lips. In Boston, one nurse wrote in her diary, "We have no more beds, no more bandages, no more sleep. But still, the patients keep coming." In India, nurses traveled on bullock carts to reach remote villages. In France, they cared for wounded soldiers and flu victims in the same tents. In South Africa, they went from house to house with nothing but soap, rags, and courage. Many of them had families waiting at home, but they stayed near the sick because they knew no one else could. Some caught the flu and died beside the people they had tried to save. Their names rarely appeared in history books, but their hands carried the weight of the world. Doctors had faced bullets and bombs during the war. Now they faced something even more frightening, an invisible enemy they did not understand. They worked without sleep, often treating hundreds of patients in a single day. Some doctors saw so many deaths that they stopped counting. They tried everything: boiled water, salt gargles, quinine, whiskey, aspirin, oxygen, mustard plasters. Some believed in fresh air, so hospitals placed beds outside in the cold wind, hoping it would kill the virus. And strangely, in some cases, it helped. Patients in open-air wards sometimes recovered faster than those indoors. In laboratories, scientists searched for answers. They peered through microscopes, trying to find the cause. They thought it was a bacterium called Pfeiffer's bacillus. They were wrong, but it was the best knowledge they had. Their failure was not for lack of effort. It was simply the limit of science at the time. Even so, their notes and experiments later helped the next generation discover what a virus truly was. The mask became the most powerful symbol of the pandemic. Simple pieces of cloth or gauze tied with strings, nothing fancy, yet they carried hope. In cities like San Francisco, posters shouted, "Wear a mask and save your life." Children wore them on their way to fetch groceries. Police officers wore them while directing traffic. Even newspaper vendors wore them as they shouted the headlines. Behind every mask was fear, but also responsibility. People learned that protecting others was as important as protecting themselves. Still, there were protests. Some citizens refused, saying masks were uncomfortable or useless. A group even called itself the Anti-Mask League. But for every protester, there were thousands who obeyed quietly. People who believed that even small acts could save lives. When you see photos from 1918, nurses in white masks, shopkeepers behind cloth veils, children playing with covered faces, you are looking at the first global moment of collective public health. It was messy, imperfect, and deeply human. In a time when women still had limited rights, the pandemic revealed their extraordinary strength. During the war, women had already taken on men's jobs in factories and farms. When the flu came, they stepped into medicine and leadership. Women ran soup kitchens, managed volunteer networks, and organized relief teams. In Canada, A young woman named Lottie Brown drove her horse cart through snow to deliver food to sick families. In Spain, Queen Victoria Eugenie turned her palace into a hospital and personally helped nurses. In the United States, women like Jane Delano, founder of the Red Cross Nursing Service, mobilized tens of thousands of volunteers. These efforts not only saved lives, they also changed how the world saw women. People began to realize that courage and intelligence knew no gender. The Spanish flu helped spark a new wave of respect for women in public life, a step that would later lead to women gaining the right to vote in many countries. Even in the worst moments, kindness bloomed. In Chicago, school teachers brought food to children whose parents had died. In London, a milkman continued his rounds every morning, leaving bottles on doorsteps of sick families without taking payment. In Calcutta, priests and monks carried bodies to cremation grounds so that no one would be left unburied. Neighbors who once barely spoke now shared soup, blankets, and hope. Those who survived often said that what kept them alive was not just medicine, it was compassion. A woman in New York wrote in a letter, "I was sick and alone. Then the lady from next door brought me tea every day and sat outside my window. I never saw her face because of her mask, but I knew she was smiling." Such simple stories became the quiet backbone of human survival. Churches, mosques, temples, and synagogues all played a vital role. Even though many services were canceled to stop the spread, faith leaders found new ways to reach people. Priests prayed outside homes instead of inside churches. Imams called out prayers over the rooftops. Rabbis and monks turned places of worship into shelters for orphans and the sick. Faith gave people strength when medicine failed. It taught them to hope when there was no cure. In some communities, people believed the flu was a test, a lesson from God to remind humanity to be humble and united. Whether or not that was true, it helped them survive emotionally. In times of despair, belief became a lifeline. Amid all the loss, there were also children who became heroes. Some cared for sick parents, cooking simple meals of soup or bread. Others delivered letters and food to neighbors when adults could not leave their homes. One story tells of a boy in Scotland who used his dog to carry medicine bottles through the snow to the next village. Another speaks of a girl in Mexico who gathered oranges and gave them to patients through the window of a hospital. They did not wear uniforms, yet their bravery was just as real. They grew up faster than they should have, but they grew up with hearts full of compassion. Information was a powerful tool, and a dangerous one. During the war, many governments censored bad news to keep morale high. They didn't want people to panic. But by hiding the truth, they allowed the virus to spread unnoticed. The Spanish newspapers, which were free to print openly, became some of the most trusted sources. They published advice: wash your hands, cover your mouth when you cough, stay away from crowds. Soon, posters carrying similar messages appeared in streets across the world. Children memorized rhymes like, "If you cough or if you sneeze, cover up, don't spread disease." It was one of the first times that public health education reached ordinary citizens on such a large scale. The media became part of the global effort, turning fear into guidance. Even though doctors could not cure the flu, they never stopped searching for answers. In 1919, scientists collected samples from the lungs of victims and began studying them under microscopes. They did not yet know what they were looking for, but they recorded every observation carefully. Those old notebooks, preserved in hospitals and universities, later helped future generations identify the H1N1 virus that caused the pandemic. It took nearly 80 years, But their work eventually gave humanity knowledge that would save lives in later outbreaks. Their persistence was an act of faith in the future. They were planting seeds of understanding that would not grow until long after they were gone. Some of the most touching evidence from the Spanish flu comes from personal letters and diaries. These writings show how people felt: afraid, tired, but still determined. A soldier in France wrote to his mother, "The bullets have stopped, but the coughing has not. Half our camp is down. Yet we still write letters because hope is stronger than fever." A nurse in Chicago wrote, "I can't stop thinking about them, but I must keep working because there are more who need me tomorrow." These voices remind us that history is not made only of leaders and generals. It is made of people with trembling hands who choose to keep going anyway. By 1919, as the flu began to fade, people emerged from their homes slowly, almost carefully. They looked around and saw how much had changed. There were fewer faces, but there was more empathy. Neighbors who once ignored each other now shared memories and meals. Cities held ceremonies to thank nurses, doctors, and volunteers. In some towns, new hospitals were built in their honor. Public health departments were created in many countries to prepare for future diseases. People had learned that the strength of a nation did not come only from armies or factories. It came from care, cooperation, and knowledge. When the last wave ended, many packed away their masks and tried to forget. But the lessons remained. The Spanish flu taught humanity that diseases do not respect borders. Truth saves more lives than silence. Science and compassion must work together. And every person, no matter how small, can make a difference. It showed that even in the face of death, people could be brave, selfless, and united. That courage became the foundation for all future responses to pandemics. Today, we remember the famous scientists and leaders, but we must also remember the unnamed heroes. The nurse who held a patient's hand until their last breath. The teacher who turned her classroom into a clinic. The child who fetched water for a sick neighbor. The doctor who refused to leave his post even when he was ill. The mother who wore her mask and whispered lullabies to her feverish baby. These people didn't make headlines, but they kept humanity alive. They were the true heroes in masks. When the pandemic finally ended, there were no victory parades, no fireworks, no bands. The world was too tired to celebrate. But in the silence that followed, humanity felt something deeper than triumph. Gratitude. Gratitude for life. Gratitude for each breath that still came easily. Gratitude for the people who had stood firm when everything else was falling apart. And as children returned to schools and workers to their jobs, the world began to heal. Slowly, tenderly, bravely. The heroes of 1918 to 1920 did not just survive a pandemic, they showed what humanity can become when fear is replaced with compassion. Their story reminds us that courage does not always roar. Sometimes it whispers behind a mask. Sometimes it knocks on a door with soup in its hands. Sometimes it simply refuses to give up. When the worst had passed, the world felt quiet. Almost too quiet. The constant ringing of church bells had stopped. The wagons that once carried the sick were gone. The streets that had echoed with coughing and footsteps of nurses now lay still under the soft light of dawn. After 2 years of fear and loss, the Spanish flu had finally begun to fade. But what remained was not peace. It was silence. The silence of a planet learning how to breathe again. By early 1919, doctors began noticing fewer new cases. Hospitals that had been overflowing for months suddenly had empty beds. In cities like New York, London, and Paris, newspapers cautiously printed headlines like, "Influenza declines across the country. The epidemic appears to have reached its end." People were still afraid to believe it. They had seen the flu vanish before, only to return stronger. But this time, the decline continued. Week by week, the numbers fell. The virus was running out of people to infect. Many who had caught it before were now immune, and the strain itself was weakening, changing into a milder version. It had burned so fiercely that it had exhausted its own strength. But the world it left behind was changed forever. Everywhere you looked, there were reminders. Empty chairs at dinner tables, closed shops whose owners would never return, children walking to school without parents by their side. In some towns, half the teachers were gone. In others, entire families had disappeared. Cities that once glowed with nightlife now moved in slow motion, as if afraid to wake the ghosts of the past. Yet in the middle of this grief, people began to rebuild, one step at a time. In San Francisco, factories reopened and workers returned wearing masks for a few more months just to be safe. In Paris, artists gathered in small groups to paint and talk again. In London, families visited the parks where children laughed once more. And in villages from India to Africa, markets reopened, filled with color and chatter after months of silence. The flu had taken lives, but it could not take the will to live. The first thing people did was care for each other. Communities came together to help those who had lost everything. Orphans were adopted by relatives or neighbors. Churches, temples, and mosques opened their doors to feed the hungry. Charities raised money for widows and single mothers. In many cities, memorial services were held not for one person, but for hundreds at once. There were too many names to read, so people lit candles instead, one for every soul lost. These moments of shared grief became moments of shared healing. And slowly hope began to replace sorrow. When nurses, doctors, and volunteers finally removed their masks and went home, they were greeted like soldiers returning from battle. They had fought a war without weapons, and they had won, not by killing, but by caring. In many countries, they received letters of thanks from families they had saved. In others, small memorials were built in their honor, but most of them simply went back to their quiet lives. They didn't see themselves as heroes, they had only done what was right. One nurse wrote in her diary, "The world is breathing again. I walk past houses where laughter has returned, and I smile. That is reward enough." The Spanish flu changed how the world viewed medicine and science. Before 1918, people often trusted rumors or home remedies more than doctors. But the pandemic showed that good science could mean the difference between life and death. Governments began investing in public health systems, departments that studied diseases, taught hygiene, and prepared for emergencies. Hospitals improved their sanitation and record-keeping. Nursing became a respected profession. And for the first time, epidemiology, the study of how diseases spread, became an important science. Doctors started keeping detailed charts of infections. They drew maps showing how the flu had traveled from one country to another. They learned that communication and transparency were just as important as medicine. These lessons would one day help save millions of lives in future outbreaks. After 1920, many countries began creating ministries of health or public health boards. They made new rules about clean water, sanitation, and quarantine. Schools started teaching basic hygiene, washing hands, covering coughs, and keeping rooms well ventilated. In the United States, the Public Health Service expanded nationwide. In Britain, the government started free medical clinics. In India, new hospitals were built in rural areas for the first time. And around the world, scientists began forming international health committees, small steps that would eventually lead to the World Health Organization decades later. It was as if humanity had woken up to a simple truth. that health was not a luxury, but a foundation for every society. Even as life returned to normal, the cause of the Spanish flu remained a mystery. Doctors still believed it was caused by a bacterium called Pfeiffer's bacillus. They didn't yet know it was a virus, something far smaller. It wasn't until 1933, more than a decade later, that British scientists finally isolated the influenza virus. And it wasn't until 1997, nearly 80 years later, that scientists sequenced its genetic code and confirmed that the 1918 flu was caused by a strain known as H1N1. That discovery explained why the virus had been so deadly. It had jumped from animals, likely birds or pigs, to humans, something rare at the time. The world had been unprepared for it, and the human immune system had never seen anything like it before. But even though people in 1918 didn't know this, they still managed to fight back with discipline, compassion, and bravery. That, perhaps, was the greatest mystery of all. How much courage can exist when knowledge is limited? For the generation that lived through the Spanish flu, life was never the same. Many lost loved ones, but rarely spoke about it afterwards. They were known as the silent survivors. They had already endured a world war and now a pandemic, two global tragedies in just a few years. They wanted to move forward, to build, to forget. In art and literature, you can still feel the echo of that sadness. Writers and painters in the 1920s created works filled with both beauty and melancholy, the feeling of people trying to celebrate life while remembering loss. Jazz music became popular during this time. Its lively rhythm was like a heartbeat returning after a long pause. People danced, laughed, and rebuilt. But deep inside, they carried memories of the winter when the world stopped breathing. The Spanish flu taught many lessons that still guide us today. Tell the truth early. Hiding disease out of fear makes it stronger. Countries that reported cases quickly saved more lives. Public health matters. Clean water, sanitation, and awareness are as powerful as medicine. Science needs support. Without funding and research, humanity remains vulnerable. Small acts save lives. A mask, a hand wash, a shared bowl of soup, simple gestures made the difference between life and death. The world is connected. An illness in one corner can reach every corner. Our safety depends on one another. These ideas were simple but revolutionary. They changed how governments planned, how cities were built, and how people saw their shared humanity. By 1920, schools had reopened in most countries. Teachers returned to classrooms filled with children who had lived through something extraordinary. They were quieter, more mature, but also more grateful. Lessons began with discussions about cleanliness and kindness. Posters on school walls reminded children to wash their hands and cover their mouths when coughing. Many of those children had lost parents, but they learned early that care for others was a duty. These were the children who would grow up to build the world of tomorrow, a world determined never to repeat such suffering. The pandemic had weakened economies everywhere. Factories had closed, farms had lost workers, and trade had slowed. But as the flu faded, industries came roaring back to life. The 1920s became known as the Roaring Twenties. People wanted to live again, to celebrate survival. Cities like New York, Paris, and Berlin were filled with music, fashion, and invention. Cars, radios, and airplanes became symbols of progress. Underneath the glamour, though, there remained an unspoken reminder. Life was fragile, and joy should never be taken for granted. The memory of the flu made people value each day a little more. The pandemic inspired a new generation of doctors and scientists. Young students who had seen the devastation decided to dedicate their lives to medicine. Hospitals began organizing research departments, something rare before 1918. Universities created new programs for microbiology and virology. In 1940, the first influenza vaccine was developed, directly because of the lessons learned from the Spanish flu. By the 1950s, vaccine programs were protecting millions every year. Even today, when people get their annual flu shot, they are receiving protection that exists because of what humanity endured a century ago. In many places, nature itself seemed to join in the recovery. After years of pollution from war and industrial smoke, the air cleared during the pandemic because factories had closed. Rivers ran cleaner. Birds returned to cities. When people finally went outside again, they noticed the world looked fresher, greener, as if it too had taken a deep breath. Families went on picnics. Farmers returned to their fields. Musicians played in open squares. Laughter slowly replaced the echoes of sorrow. The healing was not quick, but it was steady, like dawn slowly breaking after a long, cold night. Across the world, people built memorials, not just to the soldiers of the Great War, but to those who died from the flu. In villages, simple stones were placed in cemeteries with inscriptions like, "To those lost in the great sickness of 1918. These memorials were quiet, often small, but they meant a lot. They reminded people that courage is not only found in battlefields, it can also be found in hospital wards, kitchens, and tiny acts of love. Each candle lit in memory became a promise. We will remember. We will be ready next time. By 1921, most of the world had fully reopened. Trains ran on schedule again. Ships crossed oceans. Children played in the streets without masks. But if you looked closely, you could still see signs of the pandemic's legacy. Hospitals were cleaner. Cities had new public health offices. Governments talked more about disease prevention. And ordinary people had a deeper understanding of how connected the world really was. The Spanish flu had ended, but its lessons continued to shape the century that followed. No one celebrated loudly. There were no fireworks, no anthems, no medals. The world was too tired, too humbled. But in a quiet way, humanity had won something precious: awareness. People had learned that survival depended not on strength, but on cooperation. They had learned that kindness could be as powerful as medicine. And they had learned that life, though fragile, was also incredibly resilient. The Spanish flu had taken millions of lives, but it had also awakened billions of hearts. As the 1920s began, the world turned toward progress. The scars of war and disease slowly faded. Electric lights brightened homes. Telephones connected voices across miles. And airplanes began linking continents in hours instead of weeks. Humanity was entering a new century of science and innovation, one built on the sacrifices of those who had faced the darkness and survived. The Spanish flu became a chapter in history, but its spirit, the courage, the unity, and the compassion lived on in the generations that followed. When people looked back years later, they realized that the real victory was not just survival, but the rediscovery of what makes life worth living: empathy, hope, and the simple joy of breathing free air again. In the final chapter, we'll explore the legacy of the Spanish flu, how it changed the future of medicine, how it prepared humanity for later pandemics, and how its quiet lessons still shape the world today. When the Spanish flu finally loosened its grip on the world, people tried to move on. They wanted laughter to replace mourning, music to drown out the silence, and sunlight to fall again on faces no longer hidden by masks. But beneath the surface of recovery, something far greater had changed. The pandemic had left behind more than graves and statistics. It had left behind wisdom, lessons that would guide humanity for the next century. Before 1918, the world believed diseases came and went like storms, unpredictable and uncontrollable. After 1918, people understood that human actions, crowded cities, poor hygiene, delayed warnings, could make those storms stronger. Governments began to see public health as a duty, not an option. The idea that every nation should care about its citizens' health was new back then. But the Spanish flu proved that sickness anywhere could quickly become sickness everywhere. The pandemic connected humanity in an unexpected way. It reminded everyone that borders could not stop a breath, and that compassion had to travel faster than fear. From 1919 onward, almost every country created new health organizations. In the United States, the Public Health Service gained national authority. In Britain, the Ministry of Health was founded in 1919. In India and Africa, new regional hospitals and sanitation programs began. Cities improved water systems, built better sewage lines, and inspected food markets. Cleanliness became a civic duty, not just a personal habit. Doctors started tracking how diseases spread, using charts, maps, and population data. That was the beginning of epidemiology, the science of tracing and predicting outbreaks. School children learned to wash hands, ventilate rooms, and stay home when sick. Simple rules that became cornerstones of modern hygiene. The Spanish flu also sparked a revolution in medical research. For the first time, scientists worked across countries, sharing samples and observations. They realized that understanding disease required teamwork, not competition. In 1933, British researchers finally isolated the influenza virus. It took years more to understand how it mutated, changing shape each season, but that discovery would save countless lives. By the 1940s, the first influenza vaccines were developed. Governments began large vaccination campaigns during World War II, protecting soldiers and civilians alike. Every modern flu vaccine that exists today can trace its scientific roots back to 1918. In a way, the victims of the Spanish flu gave the world the knowledge to prevent future suffering. After 1918, doctors knew another global illness could happen again, so they built systems to detect and respond faster. In 1948, nations came together to form the World Health Organization, the WHO, the first global network for health cooperation. Its goal was to share information, deliver aid, and prevent outbreaks before they became disasters. This spirit of global unity, born out of the pain of the Spanish flu, has continued ever since. When later pandemics appeared, Asian flu, 1957, Hong Kong flu, 1968, swine flu, 2009, and even COVID-19 a century later, the scientific methods and safety measures came from the lessons of 1918. The masks, quarantines, social distancing, and public health announcements of the 21st century were echoes of what humanity learned during that earlier crisis. The Spanish flu didn't just change science, it changed society. Before the pandemic, most people thought health was an individual matter. After it, they saw that community health depended on everyone. People began valuing doctors, nurses, and scientists more than before. Public hospitals gained funding. Medical training expanded. Women who had served bravely as nurses and volunteers proved that they were essential to every level of society. Their courage helped open new doors to new rights, including the right to vote in many countries during the 1920s. In art and culture, people sought color and joy again. Painters used bright tones. Writers explored themes of life, death, and rebirth. The Jazz Age began, lively music for a world that had survived silence. It was as if humanity was dancing to remind itself that it was still alive. The generation that lived through both the Great War and the Great Flu carried invisible scars. They rarely spoke about what they had seen. They chose instead to focus on the future, to build, to dream, to live. Psychologists later called this collective resilience. It meant that even when the world breaks, people find ways to stand again. Communities that had been divided by class or race often found new unity during the flu. When everyone suffered together, kindness became the common language. That shared hardship planted seeds for future movements of social reform and equality. For many decades, the Spanish flu faded from history books. There were no memorials as large as those for the war, no national holidays of remembrance. Partly this was because the world wanted to forget. After so much death, people longed for normal life. They buried their memories along with their dead. But history has a way of whispering back. In the late 19th century, scientists, historians, and writers began rediscovering the stories of 1918. Letters, diaries, newspaper clippings. They realized that it was one of the most important events in human history. Today, documentaries, museums, and school lessons around the world tell that story, the story you are hearing now, so that no one ever forgets. Some words written more than 100 years ago still echo today. A doctor from New Zealand wrote, "We could not save them all, but perhaps one day our failure will teach others how to succeed." A mother from Norway wrote in her journal, "The sickness took my husband, my brother, and my friend, but it did not take my will to live. Tomorrow I will bake bread again." A nurse in India wrote, "There are moments when the world feels lost, but even then, a small act of care can guide it home." These voices remind us that history is not distant. It lives in the choices we make every day, to care, to learn, and to prepare. From the Spanish flu, humanity learned lessons that remain timeless. Information saves lives. Truth must travel faster than rumors. Prevention is power. Clean hands, open windows, and shared responsibility can protect entire cities. Science needs unity. No nation can face a pandemic alone. Compassion heals. Medicine treats the body. Kindness heals the soul. Remember and prepare. Forgetting past pandemics invites new ones. These are not just medical truths, they are moral ones. They tell us what it means to be human. It feels strange to talk about a gift from such a tragedy, but the Spanish flu left humanity stronger. It gave us the world's first vaccine programs, the first systems of disease tracking, the first global health cooperation, and a deeper respect for life. It also taught writers, teachers, and leaders to speak gently in times of fear. They learned that calm words could do more than commands. That is why even today, health campaigns use encouragement instead of panic. That quiet style of education began in 1918, when teachers and doctors realized that hope spreads faster than fear. When later generations faced new pandemics, they looked back to 1918 for guidance. The masks, the quarantines, the warnings to stay home, all came from lessons first learned then. And when people in the 21st century faced their own pandemic, many said, "It feels like history repeating itself." In truth, it wasn't repetition, it was remembrance. The world remembered what to do because the generation of 1918 had already shown the way. Those forgotten heroes, nurses, doctors, volunteers, and ordinary citizens were still protecting us a century later through the knowledge they left behind. One of the most remarkable effects of the Spanish flu was how it unified the planet. Before 1918, nations often saw themselves as separate worlds. After 1918, the idea of global health was born. The flu proved that no country was safe unless all countries were safe. That idea became the heart of international cooperation in medicine. Decades later, when scientists shared vaccines or data across borders, they were continuing a conversation that began during the Spanish flu, a conversation about unity, empathy, and responsibility to each other. Every hospital today carries pieces of that legacy. When a nurse washes her hands before touching a patient, when a doctor reports a new illness to health authorities, when researchers in one country share findings with another, they are continuing the work that began in 1918. Medical masks, vaccination drives, emergency drills, and health education posters all owe their existence to that hard-won experience. Even the habit of governments keeping national stockpiles of medicines and supplies comes from the realization that the world must always be prepared. The Spanish flu was one of the darkest chapters in human history. It killed millions, divided families, and left deep scars. But it also revealed something beautiful: the resilience of the human spirit. Through all the fear, people still helped each other. They still prayed, sang, wrote letters, planted gardens, and dreamed. They discovered that even in the worst of times, life insists on continuing. That simple truth, that love and kindness survive every storm, may be the most important legacy of all. If the voices of 1918 could speak to us today, they might say, "Do not forget us. Learn from our mistakes, but also from our courage. Keep your science strong, your hearts gentle, and your world united." The Spanish flu reminds us that health is not only about medicine. It is about empathy, honesty, and care for one another. Every generation that remembers this truth honors those who lived and those who died a century ago. In the end, the Spanish flu was more than a disease. It was a teacher. It taught the world humility. It reminded humanity that strength lies not in weapons or wealth, but in cooperation and compassion. When we wash our hands, when we cover our coughs, when we stay home to protect others, we are echoing the voices of 1918. Millions of quiet heroes whose courage still guide us. They were ordinary people who faced an extraordinary challenge. They stumbled, they learned, and they endured. And because of them, when the next storms came, humanity was ready. History is not only about battles and kings. It is also about nurses in masks, teachers reading to orphans, and neighbors leaving food at a doorstep. Those are the true stories that shape our world. The Spanish flu taught us that every small act of care matters. Every person has the power to protect another. And that even after the darkest night, the sun will rise again. By 1920, the world began to sparkle again. Children played without fear. Markets were full. The sound of laughter returned to streets that once echoed with grief. People looked back and whispered prayers of thanks, not for surviving alone, but for surviving together. The Spanish flu had tested humanity and revealed its truest face: fragile, imperfect, yet endlessly brave. And in that, it left behind a gift that still lives today: the reminder that hope is the greatest medicine of all.